If you would, open your Bible to Isaiah chapter 53. Isaiah chapter 53. We're going to be reading the first 5 verses of that chapter, and that will form the foundation for our lesson study tonight. Isaiah 53 and verse 1, where the prophet says, by asking a question, "Who hath believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness. And when ye shall see him, there is no beauty that ye should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our sorrows and surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. We did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed." Isaiah sees 2 wonderful visions of the Lord Jesus Christ in the course of the revelation that is given to him. This is the second of those visions in Isaiah 53. And perhaps it is the one with which we are most familiar, at least the one which we have perhaps read the text or heard the text read most often. The other vision of the Christ or the Messiah is found in Isaiah chapter 6. And I know that this is a vision of the Christ because the Apostle John tells me so in John chapter 12, and we'll look at that passage in just a moment. But Isaiah says, "In the year that Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. And above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he did fly. And one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke." That indeed is an awesome vision. And it presents to us the Messiah in his glory and in his authority, and seated upon his throne, ruling over his kingdom, and that authority extending out over all the earth, because the smoke fills the temple and the doors of the temple are moved at the sound of the voice of the seraphim. This is the heavenly temple, not the earthly temple. And so we see the Messiah seated upon his throne in the sanctuary of heaven, ruling and reigning. That is quite a contrast to what we saw and read just a moment ago in Isaiah 53. It is obvious that the person in Isaiah 6 is a divine person, a heavenly person, a person endowed with authority and strength and power. And yet that same person is found in Isaiah 53 suffering and dying, and that unjustly, by the hands of mere men. And the passage which we read just a moment ago in Isaiah 53, in particular verse 5, says that he, the Messiah, was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. The great problem that the Jews of Jesus' day and even the Gentiles to whom the gospel was taken after the resurrection of Christ, and even on down through the centuries to this present hour, that men have is being able to accept the Jesus that died at Calvary as their Savior, as their Redeemer, as the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Why, he was just a carpenter's son. He was an itinerant preacher that walked in one of the most forsaken places upon the earth. And he was a citizen of a nation that was regarded as being a troublesome people. And a people who were always the enemies of all the other nations, who were in themselves self-righteous because they thought they were the chosen people. So the world didn't like the Jews, and they certainly didn't like their Messiah. And the Jews didn't like their Messiah, at least not the one that they received, because he was not the one they expected. And men today question the identity of Jesus, not only on his teaching, but on the fact that he was wounded for our transgressions. And so we have a glorious Christ, and then we have a suffering servant. I said a moment ago that I know those two visions are of the same person because John tells me that they are in John chapter 12. Verse 36 is the end of Jesus' personal ministry as far as the record of John is concerned. And verse 37 begins a summation of his ministry. And John says, "But though he, that is Christ, had done many miracles before them, yet they believed not on him." Christ had come, he'd done many wonderful things, and if you're familiar with the Gospel of John, you know in particular in chapters 5 through 10, the great debates that surrounded Jesus when he came into Jerusalem, and he healed the lame man, and then he healed the blind man, and the accusations that they made against him, and how that they were not willing to accept him as the Son of God. And so they believed not on him, even though they had seen the miracles. And notice what John says there in verse 38. Why is it that they believed not on him? That the saying of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spake, "Lord, who hath believed our report, and to whom hath the arm of the Lord been revealed?" That's Isaiah 53, verse 1. Therefore they could not believe, because that Isaiah said again, and now he goes back to chapter 6 and he quotes verses 9 and 10, which just follow after that vision, where God gave Isaiah his commission. He says, "You're going to go and preach my word and preach my commandments to the people of Israel, and they're not going to believe you." And it says he said of them, and so now John applies this to those of his day, "He hath blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, that they should not see with their eyes, nor understand with their heart, and be converted, and I should heal them." These things said Isaiah when he, Isaiah, saw the Christ's glory, and spoke of him. So Isaiah presented these two images of the Messiah, and both John and Isaiah said that Israel would not believe on him because of the hardening of their hearts. They could not accept the Messiah that was being presented to them, and the Messiah that was being presented to them was the Messiah who was wounded for our transgressions. So let me suggest to you tonight that there is something that the wounds of Jesus can teach us. Isaiah was trying to help us grasp the significance of the suffering servant. He was trying to help us see that this great, glorious Messiah is indeed great and glorious, and he is able to rule and to reign because he came and suffered. And until we can understand that the Son of God came into the earth and suffered for our sins, then we are never, ever going to be able to embrace the Christ. When the Jews stood at the foot of the cross of Christ, They wag their heads and they cast their criticisms and their objections into his teeth. They assaulted him with their words and insulted him mercilessly. And so then, because of that, Paul will say later of the Jewish people, there in Romans 10, again, quoting Isaiah 53 and verse 1, but they have not all obeyed the gospel, for Isaiah saith, Lord, who hath believed our report? So then faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. They had not believed. They had not obeyed the gospel. They rejected Jesus, they rejected his teaching, and they rejected those whom he sent in the world to teach. And that hasn't changed. Men are still doing that today because they look at Jesus and they do not see what they want to see. The Jews wanted a great general, someone who was going to come in and throw off the Roman yoke of oppression. And that's not what they got. Men today want something similar to that, or they want some philosopher, or they want some great healer or miracle worker who is going to solve all their problems and cure all the ills of society. This is their idea of the Messiah. They do not understand that the problem that Jesus came to solve was the sin problem. He was wounded for our transgressions. And so until and unless we can grapple with that reality and deal with that truth, we're never going to understand who Jesus is. So I want to suggest some things to you tonight that the wounds of Jesus are intended to present to us. Things that we can learn from the wounds of Jesus, about Jesus himself and about our need for Jesus. From an apologetic or evidentiary standpoint, the first thing that obviously comes to mind is that the wounds of Jesus prove that he died and that he was raised from the dead. This is not just, perhaps in this audience, there might not be anyone who questions that reality, but generally speaking, people have difficulty in accepting the idea that anyone dies and can be raised from the dead, let alone someone dying and being raised from the dead, never ever to die again. And so this is the proposition that is put before us. In John chapter 19 and verse 30, that whole 19th chapter and the parallels in the other Gospels that deal with the death of Christ, but there in John 19 and verse 30, the record says that Jesus, when he had received the vinegar, said or cried out, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and he gave up the ghost. He died. He breathed his last is literally what that phrase, gave up the ghost, means. He said, "It is finished," and he breathed his last. Now that was witnessed by John, who was there, by Mary and the other women, by the centurion. It was confirmed by Pilate once Joseph of Arimathea came to him and asked for the body of Jesus. He sent the centurion back out there to confirm that Jesus was indeed dead already. He'd been on the cross only about 6 hours, which is a short time, relatively speaking, when you consider that crucifixion could last not just a day, but days, even up to a week. Some had been known to hang on the cross before they died. So he confirmed that Jesus was dead, and then when he did, he released the body to Joseph, and he and Nicodemus took the body and prepared it and buried it in Joseph's grave, and the women observed that. And then after the tomb was sealed, the Jews went to Pilate and said, "Remember that while this man was alive," so that tells me the Jews knew he was dead. So the Romans knew he was dead, the Jews knew he was dead, his apostles knew he was dead. The one thing that all of Jesus' friends and enemies agreed on, and it was the only thing they agreed on, was that he was dead. And so we have Jesus placed in his tomb because he is confirmed to have been dead. And then 3 days later, he's seen alive. He's raised from the dead. And notice, if you will, there in Luke 24, that when Jesus appeared to his disciples on that first Sunday, when he was raised from the dead, verse 36 says, "And as they thus spake," that is the disciples, "Jesus himself stood in the midst of them and said unto them, Peace be unto you. And they were terrified and affrighted and supposed they'd seen a spirit," a phantasm, a ghost. "And he said unto them, Why are you troubled, and why do thoughts arise in your hearts? Behold, my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones, as you see me have." When Jesus appeared to the disciples, he said, "Look at my hands and look at my feet and see that it is I myself." There was no doubting who it was. And Jesus used the wounds in his hands to substantiate his identity. Now, the folks that were there that day, there was one noticeable individual who was missing, and that was Thomas. We give him a terrible nickname. People call him Doubting Thomas. But I think he ought to be treated a little bit better than that. I think he's rather reasonable, really. I'm not going to take your word for it. I want to see him myself. And so, 8 days later, they are again within the upper room, and Thomas is with them. Verse 26 of John 20. "Then came Jesus, and the doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and said, Peace be unto you. Then saith he to Thomas, Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless, but believing." And notice what Thomas says in verse 28. "My Lord and my God." So the wounds of Jesus were evidence that he was alive from the dead. "And Jesus said unto him, Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen, and yet have believed." You see, the wounds of Jesus were not just important to Thomas, they're important to you and me. Now, we're not going to see the wounds of Jesus, not at least in this lifetime. The book of Revelation presents Jesus to us in the 5th chapter, in that vision there, as a lamb that was slain. I don't care one way or the other, but it wouldn't bother me if I had to look on the wounds of Jesus for eternity. Because that's who died for me. Those wounds are what saved me, folks. And those wounds are what's going to save you. And Jesus said, "Behold, put your fingers into the prints of the nails, thrust hither your hand into my side, and be no longer faithless, but believing." And we have the testimony of Thomas and the apostles and the women and hundreds of others who saw Jesus alive after his death. And I am persuaded that this kind of thing went on the entire time that Jesus was on the earth before he ascended back into heaven. The Bible says there in Acts chapter 1 that he was seen alive for 40 days. But he says he showed himself alive after his passion by many infallible proofs. Among those infallible proofs were these wounds that were in his hands and in his feet, and the piercing that was in his side. And that was seen of Thomas and these others, and that proves that Jesus not only died, but that he was raised from the dead. Now that ends all the skepticism. That puts to rest all of the arguments about whether or not Jesus came back from the grave and whether or not Jesus actually died on the cross for our sins. The testimony clearly says that Jesus Christ died. He was seen, he was handled. There is testimony that confirms that he was seen, and this was repeated throughout this 40 days. And there's no possible way to explain what the apostles and the early church endured if Jesus was not risen from the dead. So we begin our study tonight by just making the observation that when Isaiah says he was wounded for our transgressions, and he was bruised for our iniquities. That we can be certain that what he later says in the chapter was indeed true. Notice there in Isaiah 53, verse 9. And he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. That's Joseph of Arimathea's grave. Because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering of sin, for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days. How do you prolong the days of a dead man? He's buried in verse 9, but his days are prolonged. In verse 10, he says he prolongs his days. Now get it. Because he shall see his seed. Who is the seed of the Messiah? That's you and me. We're his descendants. So Jesus was raised for us. And that's what Paul says in Romans chapter 4, verse 25, that he was delivered for our offenses and he was raised for our justification. And you and I can rest assured, because of the wounds of Jesus, that that is so. But Jesus' wounds affirm not only that he was raised from the dead and that he did indeed die, but his wounds affirm his humanity. Jesus was like us. People get a little queasy when you say things like that. I think that's partly because they don't understand what we are. They have ideas about humanity that they can't accept about Jesus. They have this idea that we are inherently born corrupt. And therefore, if Jesus was like us, he had to have been born corrupt. Well, in the first place, you weren't born corrupt. The book doesn't teach that. The book does teach that you sinned. But now turn over there to the book of Hebrews and chapter 2, and then we'll read in chapter 4. And I want you to understand how Jesus is like us, but Jesus is not like us. In Hebrews chapter 2, beginning of verse 14, for as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, the Hebrew writer is talking about you and me, the descendants of Abraham, and they through Adam. For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy them that had the power of death, that is the devil. Let me just stop right there and put a peg down. We'll come back and talk about it again in a minute. But one of the incredible things about the gospel, and this is why people don't understand what Jesus is doing in dying at the cross, is they cannot fathom that God, in his infinite wisdom, would take death to destroy death. What does he say? That through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is the devil. Through death, whose death? Jesus' death. To destroy him that had the power of death. Well, what's the power of death? Well, sin. And so Jesus, by dying on the cross, overcame sin, and through his death, death is destroyed, folks. And deliver them that who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage, and you just read there, subject to bondage in sin. People are afraid of dying, they're afraid of death. And so they're just caught in that endless cycle. But Christ came to break that cycle. You see, this is why Adam was put out of the garden. There in chapter 3 of Genesis, God said we've got to take man, put him outside the garden, and put the cherubim, the guard of the way, to the tree of life, lest man put forth his hand and live forever. Well, what man's he talking about? He's talking about Adam who'd sinned. If Adam who sinned had been able to live forever, how in the world would Jesus be able to die for us? And so death is not a punishment for sin. Death is the means by which God in his infinite wisdom is able to redeem us. And so this is why it's so important that we understand that Jesus is a man. He's a man like you and me. I didn't say he was a man only. He's the Son of God, conceived in the womb of Mary by the Spirit of God. So he's God and man, but he's just as much man as he is God. I don't know how else to say it. I can't explain it. I know what the Bible says. He's the Son of God. He's the Son of Man. I'm going to go on and keep reading. And deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. For verily he took not on him the nature of angels, but took on him the seed of Abraham. He came through the lineage of Abraham as a man. Therefore, in all things, get that, in all things, it behooved him to be made like unto his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God. Merciful, compassionate, faithful, loyal. You realize that Jesus is compassionate toward you, and he is loyal to you. We sing that song, "Oh, what a friend we have in Jesus." That's what that's talking about when we sing that song. Not that he's our buddy. He is a loyal, true friend who's not going to give up on us. He's a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God. Now get it, to make reconciliation for the sins of the people. He was wounded for our transgressions. I'm talking about the wounds of Jesus. For in that he himself has suffered being tempted, he is able to succor them that are tempted. Jesus has experienced what you and I have experienced. Now, that's not to say he's had every experience of every person that's been on the planet, but he's had every conceivable human experience in kind. He's known grief, he's known sorrow, he's known joy, he's known hunger, he's known disappointment, he's known betrayal, he's known all of those things. He experienced what men experience. Now turn over there to the next chapter, chapter 4, and verse 14. Seeing then we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens. That's the resurrected Christ. He was raised for our justification. Seeing then that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession, for we have not a high priest that cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. The difference between you and me and Jesus is not he's different in his nature than we are. Jesus is different in his behavior than we have been. Jesus didn't sin. We were tempted. What did we do? We sinned. Jesus was tempted. What did he do? He did not sin. And because he did not sin, he is able then to make intercession for us. He is the Lamb of God. He is the one who was wounded for our transgressions, you see. And so Christ, being a man, and being tempted in all points like as we are, yet without sin, has become our sympathetic, compassionate, loyal high priest. You know, I have a good friend. He's not here tonight. I think he'll be here this week, though. Brother Burl Young preaches up at Batesville. I got a little saying from him years ago, but it expresses the truth. When he speaks of Jesus, he says his blood was red and his pain was real. You deny the humanity of Jesus, you deny the suffering of Christ. You make the whole thing into a farce. And that's not what he was. The Son of God died for you. He suffered for you. He poured out his blood unto your salvation. But it was without sin that he suffered. Third, the wounds of Jesus convince us of the love of God. I've met many religious people who just cannot reconcile the death of Jesus Christ with the love of God. I've got a couple of quotes here, one of which says, Jesus' death does not bring atonement from sin, nor is it in any way a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And the reason for that is because God is love. And if God is love, he wouldn't send his son to die. And so they just create this circular logic that they think answers this. And they have difficulty in accepting that the death of Jesus was necessary for the propitiation of our sins. And so let me ask the question, how is there divine love in the death of Christ? Well, the Bible affirms it in many different places. Romans chapter 5 and verse 8. Paul says, "But God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." So the love of God is commended toward us in that while we were yet sinners. Just a few verses north of there in verse 6, "For when we were yet without strength, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly." So the love of God is manifested in the death of Jesus Christ, because the death of Jesus Christ does something for us that we could not do for ourselves. Another passage, 1 John chapter 4 and verse 10. 1 John 4 and verse 10. "Herein is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins." Do you realize that God loved us before we were? That's in Ephesians chapter 1. From before the foundation of the world, God chose a people for his own possession through or in love. And so that the love of God was the impetus or the motive for the divine plan of salvation. He loved me before I even was. But before I was, he knew what I would be, and that is a sinner. And so still I exist, and you exist, and the world exists, and God in his infinite love, and though it may stifle the mind and challenge our reasoning ability, that God so loved, you see, that he created, even though we disappointed, and he loved, and his Son freely came into the world to die in order that his desires for a people for his own possession could be realized. So this is the love of God. Another passage that might help us along this line is Ephesians chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. I don't want to tarry here too long, but I do want to read a few verses. "But God, who is rich in mercy, for his great love wherewith he loved us, even when we were dead in sins, hath quickened or made us alive together with Christ. By grace you're saved." When we were without strength, so there's the grace. We couldn't do it for ourselves, so God did it. But what did it require? He was wounded for our transgressions. And so the death of Jesus Christ, the wounds of Christ, are in order for God's love to be manifested. God loved his Son and sent his Son into the world. I was involved in a religious discussion one time with a gentleman who made the argument that what kind of God would beat up his own Son and let him die? And I was really appalled that the man would make the statement. And he was supposed to be a Christian, but made the statement. He just couldn't believe that God would beat up his own Son and let him die. And so said that the Father would do that himself. Now you think about that a minute. What kind of father doesn't allow his Son to express his love? In John 3 and verse 16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. And he that believeth on him is not condemned, but he that believeth not is condemned already, because he hath not believed in the name of the only begotten Son." And then you just turn a few chapters on into the Gospel of John to chapter 10 and verse 16. When Jesus speaks of his having been sent into the world, he says of the Father, "Therefore doth my Father love me, because I lay down my life that I might take it again. No man taketh it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down. I have power to take it again. This commandment have I received of my Father." The Lord did not compel the Son to come into the world. The Son chose to come into the world. And in coming, the Father is expressing his love in allowing that. Think about this a moment. Perhaps someone in the audience, and this may touch your heart, and I don't mean to do so adversely, but perhaps you've had a son or a daughter who wanted to volunteer for military service. And they come to you and say, Pop, I want to join the Army. I want to join the Marines, or whatever it is. And they go and they serve. Now, are you going to deny their love of country and love of their fellow man? And which is the greater act of love on your part? To allow your child to demonstrate their love and exhibit that kind of love and faith and fidelity to their country, or for you to refuse to let them to do it? What's the most precious thing that you have? Any one of us would freely give ourselves in the place of our child. I know I would. I know you would. And I don't mean to be ugly, but my child's worth more than your child. And you tell me the same thing. You're not going to sacrifice your child for mine, and I'm not going to sacrifice my child for yours. But what if my child chooses to sacrifice herself for your child? You see? When someone saves another person's life and they are adversely affected, would you deny that love? So can we not in some small way begin to realize what the Father did? And it wasn't that he compelled the Son to come into the world. Jesus said, I lay it down of myself. And the Father says, I can take it up again. But no man taketh it from me. It was a free gift. And so in that free gift, we learn the love of God the Father, and we learn the love of God the Son, and we can cry out with the Apostle Paul as he does in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me, and the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Likewise, the wounds of Jesus assure us that we ourselves are healed. We were reading that a moment ago there in Isaiah 53, verse 5. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. The Apostle Peter reiterates that in 1 Peter chapter 2, I believe it is. Verse 24, who his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree, that we being dead to sins should live unto righteousness, by whose stripes ye were healed. You know, what we're talking about there is the atonement. And I know there are all kinds of theological explanations for the atonement. And people have a hard time being able to express it. And they want to work out the calculus on it. They want to figure out the math. How is the life of one man, Jesus, equal to the lives of all the others? How is that a sacrifice for all others? How is that a punishment or an excisement of punishment on Jesus that satisfies the punishment that was due us? Notice that's not what Isaiah says. Isaiah doesn't say that the full wrath of God for our sins was poured out on Jesus. I don't know where that idea ever came from. But he says, he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities, the chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. He's an atonement. A propitiation. That's the word that the Bible uses, a propitiation. A propitiation is that which renders an offended party favorable. It might be just a simple gift. It does not necessarily involve the idea of an exact repayment or an excising of the full penalty. It is what renders another favorable. The Bible says that you and I are saved by grace, through faith. What is it that we believe in? We believe that Jesus died for our sins, and that God has said he will pardon all those who believe in his Son. And so the grace of God is extended to us through faith in Jesus as the Son of God. Notice, if you will, what Isaiah 53 goes on to say. I'm going to jump back in there at verse 11. After he had prolonged his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand with respect to his seed, he, that is the Father, shall see the travail of his, that is the Son's soul, and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. All right? God is satisfied. God is satisfied with the death of Jesus. It's enough. When Jesus said it is finished, God said it is enough. And that's all I need to know. I don't need to figure out the math. I don't need to calculate the numbers and say, well, now, here, there's how many billions of people that lived since the beginning of time, and so then the death of Jesus. No, because my Bible says his death is worth more than enough. Why? Because he's God's Son. Just like your child's worth more to you than my child's worth more to me. Jesus is the Son of God. He's sinless. He's pure. And God is satisfied with his sacrifice. And what you've got to do is put your trust in Jesus. We spend entirely too much time trying to figure it all out and not enough time in trying to believe in it and to accept it and to understand it and be thankful for it and to recognize what that's supposed to do in our life. We're supposed to be transformed by that. We're supposed to be changed by that. Which brings me to this last point. That the wounds of Jesus imply that we may suffer just as well as he did. Ever thought about that? Going back over there to 1 Peter chapter 2. Randy Harshbarger in Nacogdoches, he likes to boil these books down to one word, so we can remember what they're about. And he likes to say, well, 1 Peter's about suffering. Well, it is. It's about suffering. It's about a lot of things, but it's about suffering. And that's a good summary of the book. And so there in 1 Peter 2, where we were reading a moment ago, Peter asked the question, what glory is it when you're buffeted or reproved for your faults? You shall take it patiently. But if when you do well and suffer for it, you take it patiently, this is acceptable with God. For even hereunto were you called. I spoke yesterday, one of the lessons, about the hope of your calling in the morning lesson there in Ephesians chapter 1. The hope of your calling, the expectation of your calling. What does your being called to Christ, what are you to expect as a result of that? Or what is expected of you as a result of that? And one of the things that's expected is this suffering. For even hereunto were you called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow in his steps. He suffered for us. Well, when did he suffer for us? When he died at Calvary for our sins. So if I'm going to put my faith in the Christ who died at Calvary for my sins, one of the things I ought to expect is that I might have to suffer too. That was the thing that the Jew didn't get. They couldn't understand how in the world that Lord in Isaiah chapter 6 could ever be this suffering servant over here in Isaiah 53. And what they didn't understand was that the road to glory involves suffering. How did Jesus get to be on that throne in Isaiah chapter 6? By suffering on the cross in Isaiah 53. And God calls us to follow the example of Jesus Christ. For even hereunto were you called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow in his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who when he was reviled not again, yet when he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. Oh, those are so powerful as words. Do we ever take time to think that when we get angry, how Jesus would behave? I've never had anybody box my ears, blindfold me, spit on me, call me awful ugly names, and spin me around and act like that, and then beat me up with rods and whips and then nail me to a cross. When he was reviled, he reviled not again. Who his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, being dead to sins, should live unto righteousness, by whose stripes ye were healed. See, that's what we're called to do. We're called to follow him and live unto righteousness. And living unto righteousness might necessitate our being called to suffering. For ye were as sheep going astray, but are now returned unto the shepherd and the bishop of your souls. So the wounds of Jesus, what do? They prove that he was raised, that he died and that he was raised from the dead. They affirm his humanity. They convince us of the love of God. They assure us that our sins are forgiven. And they imply that we may very well have to suffer too. Now, there's a very interesting passage in the New Testament where a fellow was reading the book of Isaiah one time. Acts chapter 8. Ethiopian eunuch riding along in that chariot, and the Lord called Philip to go and join himself to him, which he did. He said, do you understand what you're reading? He said, how can I except some man should guide me? So he invited Philip up into the chariot, and they rode on together. And the very passage that he was reading from were these verses that I was reading tonight. And Philip began at the same place, and he preached unto him Jesus. And I don't know how long that took or how far down the road they went or anything like that. Just I know at some point the eunuch said to Philip, see, here's water. What doth hinder me to be baptized? And he said, if you believe, you may. He said, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Now, do you believe that tonight? Then what are you called upon to do? Be baptized into Christ. I don't know that it gets any simpler or plainer than that. And then at that point, that eunuch went on his way rejoicing. Why was he rejoicing? Because he was cleansed of his sins. He was wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities. And the chastisement of our peace was upon him. And by his stripes, we are healed. You want to be healed tonight? Then this is the time and this is the place right now while we stand, while we sing.